This is actually a photo of the inside of that sterilization house. These belts were used to run the stirrers, and you can see one of the sterilization tanks right there in the center bottom. The typical chlorine dose was quite low. This was a pretty decent quality water. The organic concentrations were fairly low. John Leal figured out, doing some bench scale studies, that he only needed a fraction of a milligram per liter in order to get an effective kill. And believe it or not, they did this work without a residual chlorine method available. It's astonishing. It was all the dosing was done on the basis of how much was in the tanks and how much those tank levels fell over time. Plus, they did have, in fact, a measure of the flow coming out of the dam. One interesting side note is the mechanism of disinfection was thought to be due to nascent oxygen and not chlorine. This is important from a, shall we say, a public relations perspective. Everybody loves oxygen. Nobody likes chemicals in the water, and especially during this time period, chemicals were really thought to be anathema in food and in water, even as today. The chemophobia then was as strong, if not stronger, than today. Hard to believe. Bacillus colon or B. coli, what we now call total coliform, was not present in the treated water, and the total bacteria counts as a result of adding chlorine were dramatically reduced, down to usually single digits. And so after again, a 35 to 40-day trial, a special master approved the application of chloride of lime as meeting the requirement of other plans and devices. And his ruling was affirmed by the New Jersey Supreme Court and the New Jersey Court of Errors and Appeals, and the use of chlorine exploded across the United States. Hundreds of cities installed chlorine within simply a few years. Within 6 years, 73% of the municipal water supplies in this country were using chloride of lime feed systems. Just think about that. And shortly thereafter, liquid chlorine in pressurized tanks became available and replaced chloride of lime, but without the interim step of actually using a calcium hypochlorite feed system, there would never have been this rapid advance of the use of a significant disinfectant. This is the typhoid death rate, which dropped across the United States from 35 per 100,000 in 1900 down to below 1 at about 1941. And Life magazine cited filtration and chlorination of drinking water as probably the most significant public health advance in the millennium. Not antibiotics, not improvements in medical care, filtration and chlorination. Both Fuller and Leal were inducted into the Water Industry Hall of Fame. Fuller went on to a long and distinguished career, and as you know, an award was created in his name 3 years after he died. Dr. John Leal died only 4 years after the courts affirmed the decision to use chlorine, and his role has long been forgotten, and that's why you probably have never heard his name. Fuller died in 1934. He's buried in the family plot in Medway, Massachusetts, and he's certainly celebrated in the field of sanitary engineering. I personally think he's the greatest sanitary engineer of his time, but his involvement in drinking water disinfection in that history is largely unknown. Leal died in 1914. His grave in Cedar Lawn Cemetery is currently unmarked. I've been there. It's a bare piece of ground. I'm organizing an effort to recognize Leal as a hero of public health and erect a monument over his grave. Anyone interested in contributing to the monument can contact Laura Cummings at the Passaic Valley Water Company. It's lcummings@pvwc.com, or just give me a piece of paper with your email address on it or your business card, and we'll get back to you if you're interested. You know, it could be $1 or whatever you would like to contribute, but we think this is important to recognize this hero. And a dedication ceremony is scheduled for September 26, 2012, which is the 104th anniversary of the first use of chlorine to disinfect a municipal water supply in this country. Incredibly, John Leal is rarely given credit for this first successful application of chlorine. George Johnson, who was a laboratory technician and a treatment plant operator, has been given credit for adding chlorine at Boonton Reservoir, mostly because he wrote a couple of articles where he claimed the credit. And unfortunately, I added to the problem by contributing to the myth of giving Johnson credit in later publications. In fact, chlorination at Boonton Reservoir for Jersey City was only due to the exceptional talents of both an engineer and a physician. Leo came up with the idea, and Fuller made it work. It worked flawlessly from the beginning. If it had failed, it would have set back the chlorination of drinking water supplies, I'm convinced, decades. I finished the draft of a book on the chlorine revolution, and it's currently in the hands of several publishers for their decisions. AWWA is interested in publishing the book. It talks about the things that you've heard today, plus, of course, a lot more. Many of you might know Gay Porter Danelion. She's the head of publications for AWWA, and she would like to know if people might be interested in purchasing this book. If you would like to contact her, it would be very nice to just let her know, if you would, gporter@awwwa.org. So the question was anything going on in Europe with respect to disinfection and filtration? Slow sand filtration was very advanced in Europe, both the UK and the continent. They did not get involved in mechanical filtration until much later. In fact, sometimes it was called American filtration. And they were much more loath to put a poison in the water even than in the United States. There were a couple of instances in Lincoln, England, and in Maidstone, England, before the event at Jersey City, but they were relatively short-term, and they were discontinued after the problem was solved. So this was the first real continuous use of chlorine. It exploded in the United States, and as many of you know who have been to Europe and looked at European treatment practices, they still don't like to use chlorine. Chlorine gas was used as a terror weapon in the First World War, and that has a continuing effect on its choice as a treatment alternative. The question was, were any previous studies done on the toxicity of chlorine to people, for example, or to fish, or anything else? The answer is no. And in fact, one question might be asked, Dr. Leal, whose permission did you ask to put chlorine in the water? And his answer, and this is on the stand under oath, was, I did not ask permission. He worked for a private water company. He didn't have to ask permission at the time. Obviously, this was an incredibly foolhardy and some people might say crazy decision, but he was never criticized for it because what it did was revolutionize the protection of public health. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation.